If it's Friday, failure to launch. 17 days after his presidential announcement, Donald Trump's political future is actually in doubt after another bad week for him, legally and politically, amid growing backlash from all sides over the controversial company he continues to keep. Plus, President Biden touts a better-than-expected jobs report showing strong wage growth despite persistent fears of an economic slowdown, as the Fed tries to tame inflation without triggering a recession. And China's loosening grip on COVID. Several major cities moved to lift harsh pandemic restrictions after a wave of rare, widespread protests that apparently are working. What it means for the nation's zero COVID policy and the future of Xi's Communist Party. Happy Friday and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. It has been, believe it or not, just 17 days since Donald Trump announced officially his 2024 presidential candidacy. And in those 17 days, a lot has happened involving the former president. None of it has been good for him or his campaign. His most buzzworthy event of the last 2.5 weeks was a dinner with outspoken anti-Semite Ye, the artist formerly known as Kanye West, and known white supremacist Nick Fuentes. Trump says he did not know Mr. Fuentes' reputation before the dinner, but he did know Kanye's. And since the dinner, Kanye has made even more hateful and ignorant comments, including praising Hitler, which led to his suspension from Elon Musk and Twitter late yesterday. While Trump has not yet condemned Kanye's anti-Semitism, one of his top allies, Kevin McCarthy, told NBC yesterday that all Americans should be doing this.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Do you think it's incumbent on other Republicans more broadly to call it out? I mean, that's sort of what you are just...
Not just Republicans, it should be the entire nation.
Mm-hmm.
Strategically, if Trump's goal in declaring for the White House early was to consolidate support within the party and clear the primary field, well, by all measures, these first 17 days have been a catastrophic failure on that front. His list of endorsements right now is largely fringe figures within the GOP. The only senator backing his candidacy, Alabama's Tommy Tuberville. And the only member of House leadership is New York's Elise Stefanik. And not only has Trump failed to scare off other potential candidates, his position is so weak that some have been emboldened to speak out against him. Even former allies are now highlighting his flaws.
First, let me just say that there is no room in the Republican Party for anti-Semitism or white supremacy. And anyone meeting with people advocating that point of view, in my judgment, are highly unlikely to ever be elected president of the United States.
The former president, I don't see that he has a path through winning in 24. There's a lot of extremism there as well, just with him as a candidate and as an individual, in terms of his tone and where a lot of his messaging is and what has really surrounded him and kind of co-opted his message at this point in terms of what he's about, his brand, if you will. I don't think it's the right brand for America.
We have to find people who are putting themselves forward, who have character, commitment, and real competence. This will be the call of America. Personality and celebrity just aren't going to get it done.
And that was from Donald Trump's CIA director turned Secretary of State making those comments. The backlash from within his party is only part of Trump's weakness right now. There are also growing legal issues. These 17 days since his announcement have seen a special counsel appointed to oversee his myriad of investigations. Actually, that's kind of what the point of his campaign announcement was. He was trying to trigger a delay in these happenings. What he did trigger was a special counsel. The Supreme Court ruled that he had to hand over his tax returns to House Democrats before the House Democrats hand over the gavel. And late yesterday, an appeals court just threw out the special master appointed to go through his Mar-a-Lago documents. So if his early announcement was meant to buy him some time legally, I guess you could say it worked because a special counsel was appointed, but it does seem as if it's not working that well. Folks, we've seen Donald Trump look politically weak before, but this time may be different. Primarily because he's lost the aura of being a winner. He lost the House in 2018. He lost the presidency and the Senate in 2020. And he lost endorsement clout in 2022 when voters rejected a number of his handpicked candidates in key races. In fact, it'll be because of Donald Trump if Democrats actually gain Senate seats after the runoff on Tuesday in Georgia. His presidential campaign, meanwhile, is virtually non-existent. There have been no rallies, no trips to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, you name it. No discussions with voters yet, nothing. Instead, he's associated himself with bigots and losers. And a growing chunk of his party seems increasingly tired of his antics. Folks, if this was any other candidate and not a former president, we wouldn't call this candidacy or candidate a contender. We'd call them a gadfly, perennial candidate type of person. To be sure, Trump still has a contingent of diehard supporters. But the question that every single Republican is trying to figure out right now, especially those that want to be president someday, we know who the never-Trumpers are. How big is the always Trumper vote? With me now, NBC senior congressional correspondent Garrett Hake's been following the early days of the former president's 2024 campaign. Anna Palmer is here. She's the founder and CEO of Punchbowl News, also an NBC News contributor. Democratic strategist Doug Thornell and Republican strategist Matt Gorman. Garrett, I want to start with you. Whatever the Trump campaign is.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's always funny. I'm sure you've had this experience. You talk with somebody close to the campaign, and they're like, well, as of right now, I think it's this. Mm-hmm. It's always an as of right now, or as far as I know. You may know different because I haven't talked to him. I mean, it is the strangest campaign, even for Trump. Even by Trump standards, it's a strange campaign.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when he ran in 2016, he at least sort of modeled the campaign around his business, which was its own weird structure, but there was a structure to it. I mean, campaign staffers don't even have email addresses yet. There's really no such thing as a functional campaign around him at this point. It is largely a collection of grievances kind of running. And of all the things you mentioned, I think the only sort of pushback I would give to any of that is the only thing that I think is probably more positive for this than negative is actually the special counsel appointment, because I think what we're seeing in the early days of this campaign, such as it is a sort of a campaign about victimhood. And if he can sort of rally people around this idea that he is being targeted, he's really good politically at being a victim. And I think that's what we're going to see in the near term.
All right, but why can't he condemn the artist formerly known as Kanye West?
Because he said nice things about him. I mean, this is one of the truisms of Donald Trump from his public career and his private career is he's never been good at condemning people, no matter what terrible things they said otherwise. If they said nice things about him, that's generally, if you say good things about Trump, that's generally good enough for Trump, and it's always been the case.
Anna, what's your sense of the level of patience among elected Republicans around here for him? I mean, we know what it is off the record. Are we going to see more of them not named Mitt Romney speaking out against him?
I think we have, right? It used to be they would say the quiet part, you know, behind on the halls and in Congress and in one-on-one conversations. And now you really are starting to see it's not just Mitch McConnell, who clearly has not had any love for Trump in a very long time, but you're starting to see other Republicans tire, whether it's saying, hey, you know what, we don't want a three-time loser. It's time to look forward. We need to be more forward-looking. I don't think they're ready to just dump him completely because every Republican that's elected is still concerned about the Trump support and the base, and they need them for their own political future, but they are being a little bit more forceful.
Look, I think I have this poll number here, Matt Gorman, which is the number we've been tracking since he was president. Do you consider yourself a Republican before a Trump supporter or a Trump supporter before a Republican? And we've recorded him at 30%, which is the lowest he's been recorded. It had, you know, gotten almost that low right after January 6th, popped back up. It was as high as 54 during his presidency. Is 30 the ceiling or the floor now inside the Republican Party for Trump?
It seems to be a very slippery ceiling. Yeah. And we talked about this a little bit a few days ago, but I think the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And I think what you're starting to see is the people who voted for him in 2016 and in both general elections, liked him as president, liked what he did, suddenly saying, you know, they've had their fill. They've become indifferent to him. They want to move on a little bit. And I think it's not going to be the Lincoln Project crew. It's not going to be the Mitt Romney's never Trumpers. The people that will end Trump in the Republican Party will be those people.
But 30% still wins you a primary or a
well,
lot
that's
of
the thing.
primaries.
If it's 30, what if it's not 30, right?
But wait a minute. That's not support, though. That's Trump Republican. And you can consider Pence or more Pompeo Trump Republican.
You know, I think we're in the Gary Busey phase of The Apprentice. Right? When it was like Gary Busey was the star of The Apprentice, that's when you knew the show, you know, the whole thing was ending.
Yeah.
It was coming to an end.
This is like season 6 of the show.
Right. It feels like this whole bizarre, he will not, I mean, Elon Musk is condemning Kanye West, okay? And Donald Trump won't.
Yeah. Well, I have to laugh a little bit because I feel like this is a conversation we all have had so many times. over the years.
Since the summer of 2015, and he said John McCain was no hero to me.
Right.
Well, since that moment, we've had this conversation.
And we've also had the conversation about, well, you know, the Republicans are finally like starting to separate, right? You thought Charlottesville would be the moment when that would happen. You thought maybe when Trump incited an insurrection against this country and had all his followers take over the Capitol. I'm not buying this yet, you know, because at the same time, you still look at polls. Morning Consult has a poll out that has, you know, Trump still leading. And at the end of the day, he still has a very strong hold over this party. Democrats won a lot of these races in 22, largely by painting them as extremists. And that's playing out right now. And for Kevin McCarthy, who a month ago was thinking about November being such an amazing month for him, this has not only been a bad month for Trump, it's been an awful month for Republicans.
It really has.
Awful.
No, I think that's the question here. Matt, the party is being associated with anti-Semites. It's not just Donald Trump. Like, isn't that the flashing red light here?
I was really surprised because, to your point, one person we didn't mention was Rick Scott, who's really taken pains to align himself with Trump throughout this whole last 2 years. He was one of the first people. He was talking, I think, to you guys on the Hill on Monday, separating himself. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, and also, again, McCarthy's comments I thought went very far. That is an issue, I think, and that's why you're seeing people come out so strongly.
And you know who hasn't said anything is DeSantis. Now, I know there's a strategy behind that, but he hasn't said anything.
Not a word.
He doesn't need to.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm with you in the sense that I would say this, is that I think everybody has been very quick to say Donald Trump, this is the fall of Trump, and he is Teflon, and it has been. The question is, you know, if people think that he's a winner or will help them in their House races or in their primaries, he's not going to go away.
I want to come back to something, though, that reinforces your point, Doug. The Republican Jewish Coalition statement. I want to bring it back again when they're condemning Kanye West.
Brutal.
Conservatives who have mistakenly indulged Kanye West must make it clear that he is a pariah. Enough is enough. Conservatives?
Yeah.
Is it conservatives?
Well,
or is it Donald Trump?
It's not just Donald Trump.
But it's, okay, if it wasn't for Donald Trump, but for,
there's
where would
another
it be?
show that happens in this building
Tucker
on another
Carlson. There's
network,
no doubt.
exactly,
Tucker
that
Carlson
put
is
him on
platform.
TV.
But he's not president of the United States and probably never will be. I think we all have to question. We'll question
set that aside, please.
But the point is, he's not an elected official.
No.
The person mainstreaming Kanye West is the former president of the United States.
I agree, and a whole host of House Republicans jumped on that bandwagon, and there's a cultural affinity here. Kanye and House Republicans and Trump have the same enemies, or had the same enemies, and I think that was the reason they liked him, right? This idea of if you're a sort of cancel culture, woke mob, whatever, Kanye's on our side against those people. Now they're seeing who else Kanye's side he is on, and it's no longer acceptable. So yeah, I mean, look, Trump's going to be the one who's ultimately going to have to sign the divorce papers there for the rest of the party, but the rest of the party is out the door on Kanye.
Matt, I want to go back to, because I agree, we all know what the strategy of DeSantis is. It's not to speak out, right? Like, you know, don't, like, try to let Trump punch himself out.
Didn't work in 2016.
Well, but, you know, I don't see why it's seen as a loser to condemn Kanye West.
I think a couple things, and I'm trying to put myself in his shoes right now. I think, if you're DeSantis, you're looking at it, and I actually think in his mind he'll be punching down. I think you don't want it. Why pick a fight when your guy's speeding up? Why push somebody if he's speeding off a cliff at 90 miles an hour and going at this, right?
No, I understand that about Trump.
But what I'm saying is essentially by coming out in that, you're making it a DeSantis-Trump fight. And then all of a sudden, candidly, the news becomes the DeSantis-Trump proxy war and less Trump.
No, that's a fair point.
But I've heard from some Republican strategists when they're talking about the upcoming primary that the only way that someone's going to beat Trump is if they take him on and beat him up. And so, you know, maybe DeSantis wants to wait.
Yeah, because the people that do, who are the people that like Trump? That he's willing to take the fight. That he is willing to piss you off and me off, right? And so, the person that replaces him, and that's what makes DeSantis seem so appealing.
I also think DeSantis is trying to go after some of those same votes, right?
Correct,
Look,
that's what I mean,
DeSantis was Trump's water boy in 2018.
Right.
So let's not forget how closely aligned he was.
Which is what would make him an interesting person to be the one to take him out.
He is Trump without the distraction.
Right.
Well,
I mean, he
did send a
I am so not convinced about Ron DeSantis. This guy has never done a national interview. He's never sat in front of the national press in any way. He's never talked to a human being in another state that's not Florida. At some point, Some one person has to beat Donald Trump. The Major League Baseball can't beat the Yankees, right? Like the Red Sox have to go beat the Yankees.
Right.
Some one person has to consolidate this and go beat Trump. And I have not seen anything from DeSantis that suggests he can do that over the course of an 8-month, 9-month primary.
And the strategy of, well, we'll just let him hang himself. Like, that didn't work in 2016.
Cool. Ask President
again,
Jeb.
we're coming.
Yeah. Sorry. Man, that was a little out of bounds.
Wow, and close to the bone.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, look, I think in terms of the point before, again, if you're thinking about this strategically, two things. We're about a month out from the midterm elections. There's a long way to go if you're DeSantis before you take the fight to Trump. And you also want to do it on your issues. That's COVID. You want to find the strategic set of issues. You don't chase down every rabbit hole. That's what Trump wants. He wants fights on all fronts. You go after him strategically, and you can do it on something like COVID.
Yeah. I guess the one question I have is, on one hand, Trump is vulnerable now. Trump is weak now. Are they going to regret missing this moment? I know there's a lot of people saying, hold off. I think they're going to let him heal, and I don't know if that's going
Nobody votes for a year. How do you beat him now?
Well, you marginalize him.
But also, there's no rallies. He's not doing anything to build himself back up.
No, that's
right.
So
which I think is the most telling.
Yes.
Thing, right?
Well, do you think how many people would show up for a Trump rally? I'm not. Look, some will, but I think that is something they fear that maybe they can't fill the rooms that they used to be able to fill.
Well, the other
he's
thing
not
is,
in Georgia.
No, he's not.
I also think, like, Kevin McCarthy right now is trying to figure out how he can put together enough votes to become speaker. And there are a lot of Republicans, I think, and so I think he's got to. I think, I know he said what he said, but at the same time, I think he's probably going to go to get. At some point, he'll go kiss Trump's ring again.
We have two really good nose counters here. When it comes to
First
of all, do we have Ralph Norman's anonymous candidate? Just wait. The man behind the curtain, Ralph Norman, claims we have a great candidate. You've not heard it. He's not a member of the House. Do we know who it is yet, Anna?
I have not heard who it is yet.
It's not you, Matt.
It's
Lee Zeldin. Is it Lee Zeldin?
I mean, listen, I think there's still a lot of time for Kevin McCarthy to put this together. And I would say he's been very strategic, and he's doing exactly what he needs to do so far to get there, in the sense of letting all these conservatives have these votes. Let's the air out of the kind of the anxiety around. Matt Gaetz is not leading the promised land of Republicans to another speaker. There is no one else. It's not going to be Steve Scalise.
Why?
I think people underestimate how closely their political lives have been tied.
I agree with that. But if the whole point of this, Garrett, is not to find another speaker, it's just to prove they can deny McCarthy the speakership, I think that's all they want to prove, because it basically is a threat to the next speaker. At any point in time, we can deny you the speakership.
That requires a level of strategic forethought that the Freedom Caucus has not, to this point, demonstrated that they have. I mean, yes, do I think they can blow things up? Yes, but I also think they don't have an actual plan to do this other than to delay. And I think the kind of delay gives McCarthy an opportunity to pick people off.
But to me, that's how Scalise ends up with
closer.
it. They want to be able, their easy out is, okay, fine, we'll rally around Scalise. We just wanted to prove that McCarthy.
That it wasn't him?
Yeah.
I don't see it.
To your point, McCarthy's not prepared. He's very patient, to your point. He gets a bum rap, but he's very patient.
Yeah.
I still think of the Holy Grail moment in Last Crusade. Let it go, son. Let it go. Every time McCarthy gets close to it, somehow the black hole of politics will grab him. Anyway, this was terrific. I didn't have to say much. You guys I appreciate it. Coming up, we got a strong jobs report. It defied expectations. I feel like we say that almost every month. And guess what? The stock market hated it. We're going to break it all down and what it means with a former top White House economic advisor. That's next. Plus, NBC got to sit down with the Republican closer in the Georgia Senate runoff. It's the governor of Georgia and what he's saying about running against Trump and who should do it in 2024. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President Biden is in Boston right now. These are some live pictures of the president as he will be participating in a phone bank to help raise money for Senator Raphael Warnock ahead of next week's Senate runoff in Georgia. Yes. Earlier, the president met with Prince William, who is in the United States for the first time in 8 years. They met at the JFK Library in Boston. Before leaving Washington, President Biden signed legislation to avert a strike by rail workers, which the administration warned would have devastated the economy, particularly around the holidays. As we've noted, this issue has threatened to drive a wedge between the president and some of his union supporters who wanted to hold out for a better deal with the addition of extra sick leave days. In his remarks this morning, Biden tried to reassure those workers that he hadn't given up on fighting for those extra benefits.
And look, I know this bill doesn't have paid sick leave that these rail workers and, frankly, every worker in America deserves. But that fight isn't over.
In those remarks, the president also touted the November jobs report, which revealed an economy that is still growing. We added 263,000 new jobs last month. It, of course, beat expectations. The report also showed that wages are growing at a healthy clip. NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joins me. So, Kelly, walk me through the Boston trip. It is sort of odd. Explain why he's traveling to Boston to raise money in Georgia.
Well, it's even a little hard to follow as the president is making his remarks to the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Part of the thinking is that the president can be anywhere and his message resonates far beyond the actual location. So he is there to talk with union labor, and they are doing a phone bank to try to get out the vote and support Democrats in Georgia who are, of course, looking toward that Senate runoff, and that the president can be in one place and have an impact in another without actually going to Georgia. As he was talking about it, it was, of course, the president extolling these good men and women of the labor movement about Raphael Warnock, for whom they cannot vote, but they are, in fact, there trying to help support his cause as members of the labor labor movement and labor unions. And so he is there, as you see on the screen. Labor is a big part of the president's constituency, and so especially today, given the way you introed our segment here, he is concerned about protecting that relationship, showing the strength of his ties to labor at a time when they weren't able to get everything that labor wanted in that rail contract. At the same time, the White House feels this is one of the strongest periods on economic news that the White House has been able to tout, with the strong job numbers, the fact that the unemployment level is so low that gas prices are coming down, and that they were able to avert this rail strike, which could have been cataclysmic for the economy. So they feel like those are some good conditions. You add to it, the Boston piece was necessary in order to see the Prince, the Prince of Wales and Catherine in Boston for their environmental things. So there were a lot of moving parts to make it work for a busy day for the president, but he's checking a lot of boxes, Chuck.
Boy, it's been a busy week, no less, too. The state dinner, all of that business.
Yes.
Anyway, Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Kelly, thank you. Let's dig in a bit on this November's jobs report. Joined now by Betsy Stevenson. She was, of course, a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. She served as chief economist at the Labor Department. She's now a professor at the University of Michigan. Well, all right. So this report seems to indicate what to you? Because it looks to me as if, all right, I don't know what more the Fed can do to slow inflation if part of that goal is to slow down job growth. We're not slowing down job growth.
Job growth definitely remains very strong. And, I think the question is, how worried does the Fed need to be because of this report? The obvious worrying sign here that everybody's reacting to is just, red hot wage growth. And why is it? It's not that the Fed doesn't want people to get wage growth. Can I just tell you, Betsy,
I know, it sounds awful. Oh, it's terrible that people are making more money. I mean, I get it, but you see this is where I think I really worry about people's perception of government when they think, does the Fed just not want the economy to grow? I don't understand.
So I think what they want is they want to see wage growth for the right reasons. We get wage growth when we get more productive in our jobs. And if we get wage growth that's above that sort of level of productivity, it could be mean that our employer's next step will be to raise prices. And what we don't want is to develop a two-step dance where employers give us wage increases, then they raise the prices of their goods and services, then we want more wage increases, then they raise the price of their goods and services more, and there what we get is ongoing inflation. Right. So the Fed has got to stop that cycle. I think that, everybody says don't read too much into one report. I think that's true. I also think it's true. It's important that we put this report in the context of everything else that we're hearing. So, if you looked in the IT sector in this report, what you saw was a sector on fire. Faster job growth in the last month than the previous month. And overall, that sector has hired well above anything you would have predicted prior to the pandemic. And the wage growth has been through the roof and continuing to rise in that sector. But I don't know about you, I've been hearing a lot of stories about tech sector layoffs and people losing their job. So the question is it starting to cool? I think the layoffs tell us that there's more cooling happening in the tech sector than we could see in this monthly report. And then there are questions, are there other sectors like that? Manufacturing continued to add jobs in this report, but ADP told us that they think there's a cool down happening in manufacturing jobs. And frankly, it seems like there should be a cool down there given the fact that we're all starting to pull back a little bit on the stuff that we're buying. So maybe the labor market's not quite as hot as this report indicates. If I was the Fed, I would stay the course at this point. They know that they're going to raise rates again in December, probably 50 basis points. You're looking at this report, you're going to do that, and you're going to look really hard at the next report and say, do those signs of cooling down show up? Or are we worried that, it's basically the reason the wage growth can be problematic is the idea is like there's one person available for the job and we just keep fighting over them, offering them more and more money. We don't want that. What we want is people to get jobs. We want new people to come into the labor force. We want to bring people back who stepped out due to the pandemic.
And this is the issue. And I guess I want to come back to, and I do this, I think, with you almost every month, which is there's only so much the Fed can do about the labor market. And that the real problem is the fact that we do have a hot jobs market because we don't have a big enough labor force because we've shut down legal immigration in this country for the last 6 years, and it's finally catching up to us, is it not?
Well, immigration would certainly help us out a lot here. What we saw throughout the pandemic was a decline, a pretty large decline in the share of foreign-born workers compared to the path we were on prior to the pandemic. But, that decline in foreign-born workers started before the pandemic. We were starting to make people feel unwelcome. And then when a pandemic hit, is it any surprise that a bunch of people packed their suitcases and headed home? So I do think we need to make the U.S. more welcoming. We also have to make sure that we're addressing long COVID so that older workers can come back into the labor force. We're seeing people retiring younger. The problem with retiring younger is it's a lot of years you got to support yourself with no income. If you retire at 55, I hope you're going to make it to 85. 30 years is a lot to try to live off the money you made in the previous 30 years. So we really want people to come back for their own sake. We want them to be healthy enough to come back, and we want the working conditions that bring them back. And then we also want to just make sure that everybody feels included in this labor market, because we are seeing a very disproportionate response. It's college-educated workers who've come back the fastest, the hardest. Women have come back more than men have. That's a big shock, right? Women got hurt more in this recession. But, women, no disrespect to men, but women, after every recession, women seem to be a little bit more resilient and they come back a little bit faster. And that's partially because they're willing to branch into new occupations. Women, this month, women took all the new jobs in manufacturing. That's not normal, right?
So that tells you something.
Yeah, it tells you something. Women took all the new jobs in business and professional services. In fact, men lost jobs in that category. Why am I, we can go through each little category, but the broad picture is that women added jobs in a lot of male-dominated occupations in this past month, more than their sort of share in that sector, and in many cases more than men did. So we need to make sure that men are coming back, and that I know it hurts when you've lost your job and you've been disconnected for a little while, but we got to work together as a community to pull these men back in.
Come back, try a new line of work. But working is good. Exactly.
Working is good.
Betsy, I always learn something from your appearances here, especially on these monthly when we're trying to unpack when good news is bad news for Wall Street and bad news is good news, up is down, down is up, et cetera. Betsy Stevenson, always a pleasure. Thank you. Up next, President Obama and Governor Kemp making a final play for their respective candidates ahead of next week's heated Senate runoff in Georgia. We're going to get on the ground for the latest, including what Brian Kemp is saying these days. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Today is the last day of early voting in Georgia before Tuesday's Senate runoff election. As we've noted, some Republicans are still hesitant about their party's nominee, Herschel Walker. Georgia's own outgoing Republican Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan told CNN earlier this week that he couldn't bring himself to vote for Walker. He didn't vote for Raphael Warnock either, he says. However, the state's newly reelected governor, Brian Kemp, has been out stumping strongly for Walker. My colleague Vaughn Hillyard spoke to Kemp yesterday, asking him why hesitant Republicans should reconsider and cast their ballot for Walker. His answer was revealing because he boiled it down to one thing: jersey color. Take a listen.
I'm fighting hard for Herschel because I think it's important that we have a Republican in that seat. I mean, you really have two choices in this election. You can vote for the incumbent that's voted for Joe Biden 96% of the time, that has put states like California and New York ahead of our own when it comes to American Rescue Plan dollars and treating our citizens unfairly compared to those in California and New York. And I want somebody to go up there and fight for our state. I believe that Herschel Walker will do that, and that's why I'm supporting him, and that's why I would ask other Georgians, no matter what camp they're in, to do the same.
Vaughn Hillyard, who sat down with the governor, joins me now. Boy, Vaughn, that was not the best endorsement of Herschel Walker I've heard before. It was not an endorsement of Herschel Walker. It was simply, as we introed, it was simply the case against putting a Democrat in the seat.
Right. I wouldn't necessarily say that he said good things about Herschel Walker. It was more about having a Republican partner up on Capitol Hill to work with. And this is sort of the bargain that we have seen played over the last several years among several types of Republican candidates. Brian Kemp, through the course of the general election, he did stay away from Herschel Walker. He really ran his own independent race, won by 8 percentage points against Democrat Stacey Abrams. And that's why when you look at a 38,000 vote difference coming out of the general election in this U.S. Senate seat, if you're Brian Kemp, you ask yourself the question, could you have an impact ultimately on who serves the state of Georgia for the next 6 years? And the calculation is that that answer is a hopeful yes for Brian Kemp, especially with Donald Trump not being the one to come into the state here in the final week. And as many Republicans would tell you, screw it up. I want to let you hear a little bit more of the interview as to why Brian Kemp decided to jump into this. What has led you to go out on the stump for Herschel Walker despite these questions about his character?
Well, look, I think you can say there's questions about the characters of all the candidates that ran for U.S. Senate and the two that remain in the runoff. For somebody that's been in politics and has been personally destroyed and had their family members targeted, you know, I understand why a lot of people don't put much stock in things like that, especially 4 days before the election.
And when I asked him, I actually read him a direct part of the Daily Beast article that came out yesterday, in which a woman came forward on the record detailing a particular episode in which she alleges that she was physically attacked by Walker. And he said that, you know, there are questions about the character of both candidates that are in this runoff here. Again, not directly going on the defense necessarily of Herschel Walker, but making his choice, at least in this runoff, clear.
Hey, does he consider himself an anti-Trump Republican?
I think it's more of an individual that ignores Donald Trump and his existence. I asked him about whether he believes that he should take really the mantle at this moment in time as the Republican Party is looking to potentially go on a new trajectory. And he said he is focused particularly on this runoff here. But he said that he is an individual who has said from day one when he was sworn in 2019 that he would serve the people of Georgia, he would uphold the Constitution. And he said that he has done that every step of the way, and he intends to do that as governor as the second term. I asked him about 6 or 7 times, Chuck, whether he would be open to a 2024 run, and he declined to ever rule out that he would not mount his own 2024 run against Donald Trump. But that's where he's kind of this unique American figure, the only statewide Republican who stood up to Donald Trump over the last 4 years, and then turned around and beat a Trump-endorsed candidate in the primary, and then won in a competitive general election.
Well, and that's sort of what I'm can't figure out here, Vaughn, is he's accumulated some political capital, but he doesn't seem to want to use that capital to help Herschel Walker that much.
No, I mean, he did cut a TV ad. He did cut a TV ad, and he has been on the campaign trail once, which was more than a week ago now. To your point, he's not out there today. He's more likely to be at the SEC championship game with the Bulldogs tomorrow than he is on the campaign trail with Herschel Walker. But I think this is where the question is, does he use his political capital, or do we take him at his word that he cares about Georgians and pushing through with the Republican legislature more conservative policy items here in the state of Georgia over the next 4 years? He's not somebody who is really grabbing the opportunity by the horns to really be a national Republican leader.
He really could if he wanted to.
He's here in Georgia kind of doing his thing.
That's my point. The opportunity is there if he wanted it. Put it this way. If Chris Sununu were in the same position in New Hampshire,
right,
I think we'd see a different... That's all. It's fascinating to me. You going to be at that SEC title game? If you're covering Georgia Senate, I bet you all the candidates will be.
We're planning to be at least the tailgate.
Be in the tailgate. I was just going to say, you may get an early warning sign of what Tuesday will be like. Vaughn Hillyard on the ground in Georgia for us with his interview with Governor Kemp. Vaughn, good work there, sir. After the break, China's government appears to respond to the mass protests that gripped the nation this week by backing down on some COVID rules. Dare we call that small d democracy? Details next, but first we're excited to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with clips and highlights from the best archive in the news business. You can explore our special, interactive, online. Just scan the QR code on your screen right now, and it'll take you to the site. So, in recognition of World AIDS Day yesterday, here's former Congressman Henry Waxman. He was then chair of the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, speaking on the politicization of the AIDS epidemic in 1987. We think it's the first time AIDS was discussed on Meet the Press.
Is AIDS becoming a big political issue? It sounds like it.
Well, it sounds like the right wing would like to make it a political issue, and I think that is a reprehensible activity when we're facing an epidemic where we need to follow the guidance of the health people and not let this thing go to the point where we panic people, and that is irresponsible. It's like crying fire in a crowded theater, and it's to be condemned fully.
Welcome back. China is now easing some of its COVID restrictions in an apparent response to nationwide protests against them. That's how things usually work in democracies. The nation's zero COVID policy has been defined by mass testing, strictly enforced quarantines, and citywide lockdowns. Despite these severe measures, China saw another surge in COVID cases recently. Some health experts attribute the rise in cases to China's poor vaccination strategy, especially among its elderly population. Its COVID vaccine is also viewed as less effective against the highly transmissible Omicron variant when compared to the mRNA vaccines used here in the United States and across most of the Western world. NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Fryer has the latest on the changes China is making to their COVID strategy in the wake of the unrest.
China's government appears to be rethinking its COVID strategy, ending lockdowns in some cities and other small moves like reducing the need for a negative COVID test to take the subway. China's Vice Premier Sun Chunlan, who's been the official face of every grim lockdown announcement, said the country is moving to a new stage and mission. She used the term baby steps, meaning the vast COVID system isn't going away, but they will make adjustments to how people use it. There are still fears, though, that after years of tough COVID controls, along with a ban on foreign vaccines, have left the country with very little immunity. A low vaccination rate among the elderly as well could see a wave of COVID infections once the rules are relaxed. Unusually, China's government appears to be responding to public pressure after those extraordinary protests demanding an end to zero COVID rules and challenging the leadership of Xi Jinping. Those protests have been largely suppressed by police using data surveillance and intimidation. The leadership hasn't said anything about the protests, but officials are now changing the way they talk about COVID, playing down the severity of getting the virus and even allowing discussions of it on social media. So the messaging appears to be changing here. The lockdowns, the quarantines, the other tough controls that protesters were calling out, those will take longer to unwind, with cases already at a record high here and likely to surge. Janice Mackey-Fryer, NBC News, Beijing.
Big thank you to you, Janice, for that. Reporting from Beijing, I'm joined now by Ian Bremmer. He's president of Eurasia Group and author of the book, The Power of Crisis. So, look, Ian, I'm sort of being a tad facetious here about democracy breaking out in China, but when a government responds to protests and responds favorably to what the protesters are talking about, that's usually the way a democracy works. What do you make of what we saw here?
Well, let's compare it to other places, authoritarian regimes, where we're seeing similar sorts of outbreaks. Right in Iran, you've got much bigger demonstrations. The supreme leader said, "Talk to the hand. I'm not going to do a damn thing for you." In Russia, you've seen lots of demonstrations on the back of a failing Russian war when they announced it, and then with the call-up of the 300,000 troops. A lot of repression, only escalating the war. China, a lot smarter. And there's a reason why Xi Jinping is the most successful consolidated authoritarian ruler in the world, in any major country today. And it's not just because he knows how to use repression, but also because when he gets himself in a jam, he can also turn that pressure down. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing carrot and stick. The people that involved in those demonstrations, they've been followed up with. Some have been arrested, and those that haven't have been told, you do this again, you will be. And I don't think we'll see these demonstrations again going forward, irrespective of how some people are going to continue to be very frustrated with the level of lockdown. But this does also show a willingness to respond to a lot of anger. And Xi Jinping's in a position he can get away with that, and he still has complete control.
And I assume this is also fear of this impacting the economy and economic growth. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters to Xi, right?
No question that political stability is an enormously important thing for him, but economic growth is too.
Well, you can't have economic growth without political stability, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And they have been willing. They've talked about high quality growth as opposed to just growth, and so much more discussion of political stability and security issues than growth during the party Congress, when Xi Jinping had the entire Communist Party leadership collected to ensure that only his loyalists were in place. And frankly, the economic technocrats that were running the economy, that were focused much more on growth, are all heading out of power when the cabinet comes together in March. And so I don't think you're going to see, sort of the return to 5-6% growth that you've had over the previous years. But the people have spoken about unwillingness to have their lives disrupted this badly for this long. And I think that the willingness of the Chinese government to take greater risks in terms of their hospitals getting overwhelmed, in terms of more people getting killed, is going to happen as a response of the Chinese people saying, we're just not going to take this anymore.
Well, the question is he going to admit his vaccine didn't work?
No, absolutely not. In fact, he's not going to admit that his policy didn't work at all. What you're going to see is, number one, a focus on poor implementation, overzealous regional officials that went too hard, too strong, and they didn't carry out my policies effectively. You'll see that. Some of those people will be removed from power. You'll also see a suggestion that, well, the disease is different than it was before. It's not as dangerous. It's not as lethal, and we've vaccinated more people. But no, you're not going to see Xi Jinping in any way admit that he made a mistake.
You brought up, I want to talk about one country you brought up when we were talking about repression attempts, and it's Iran. Iran seems quite vulnerable. This feels like a moment the West shouldn't miss. Do you think they're going to?
I think that there's no chance of getting an Iranian nuclear deal in place, of course, because no one's going to, reward the Iranians for this kind of repression. But this is really on the Iranian people. I mean, I think it's great to see that Starlink, for example, is on the ground there and helping people communicate, especially when the Iranians are shutting down their internet for folks. But I also think the Americans and other countries are going to be very reluctant to actively get involved insofar as it helps the government itself say this is about foreign actors. So I think they're going to be very cautious. But of course, everyone wants to see the back of this theocracy. And they are indeed under a great deal of pressure right now. Their willingness to use repression is incredibly high. We've seen that in the Kurdish region already. Whether we start seeing that in the major cities and in Tehran itself, that's an open question.
And that's risky on the regime's part. That is, in some ways, quite risky. Ian Bremmer, always a pleasure to get your perspective. Nice to see you. Still to come, fighting for first. The White House is now weighing in on which state gets to vote first in the Democrats' 2024 presidential nominating contest. Here's a hint. If you want to be first, be a state that actually gave Joe Biden a primary victory. We have more NBC reporting after the break. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. If you want a clue about President Biden's intentions in 2024, just look at how he wants to shake up his party's presidential primaries. The White House is now pushing for South Carolina as first in the nation for 2024, pointing to its diversity. It would mean doing away with Iowa and New Hampshire as the first states to hold contests. Notably, South Carolina was the first state Biden won in the 2020 primary season, a victory that single-handedly salvaged his campaign, propelled him to win the Democratic nomination just before the COVID lockdowns. The proposal has set off a firestorm within some corners of the party, not surprisingly, particularly in New Hampshire and Iowa. New Hampshire Senator Maggie Hassan tweeted her opposition to the plan, adding, "Make no mistake, New Hampshire's law is clear, and our primary will continue to be first in the nation." Natasha Korecki is the senior national political reporter for NBC News and joins me now. Natasha, look, Mark Murray and I joke that this feels like fan fiction right now because we're all hyperventilating over a primary calendar that's irrelevant if Joe Biden is seeking renomination. But it was a bit of a surprise that he picked South Carolina to be first.
It was a surprise. It was a surprise even to people in South Carolina. I mean, when I called Trav Robertson, who's the Democratic chair last night, right after we found out about this, he was laughing. I mean, he was just in complete disbelief. They didn't even ask for this, and Biden gave it to them, essentially saying to Iowa, hey, the feeling's mutual, Iowa. You don't want me, I don't want you. So this is what they're doing going forward. And the committee that has responsibility over this today, just now actually, approved it. They only had 2 dissenting votes, and they were, guess who? Iowa and New Hampshire.
Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So so that's moving forward. The full DNC has to approve this next year. But again, you know, and we've discussed this before, Chuck, you know, what kind of teeth is there with the punishment? Because New Hampshire and Iowa are saying we're going forward.
They're still going to, I was just going to say, the problem they have is, and I keep trying to explain this to people, the states are going to have their say. The DNC and RNC can do all they want with discussing things, but there are state laws on the books that dictate when these, you know, and by the way, who's going to pay for this? You know, the South Carolina Democratic Party has to pay for most of the primary costs. The state does pay for some of it now, a little bit for the Republicans, a little bit, but it, you know, and if you want a state to pick up the tab for the primary, well, you're going to, you know, the state law may decide that. I mean, you know, do Democrats want to have to fund their own firehouse primaries in some of these places, which will, I think, that ends up complicating everything. So, you know, I think we got a long way to go before we know for sure what the next primary calendar looks like when there's an open fight for the nomination.
Right. And it is a Pandora's box. You're right. I mean, every time you try, it's like, you know, Jenga, you try taking one piece out and everything's about to collapse. Now, they can do some kind of punishment for candidates. You know, that's something they're exploring right now. And they're trying to see if they can get some teeth. So we'll see where they go with that. But you're right. There is some early talk now. Is who's this benefit? It benefits, of course, Joe Biden. But you're looking at a potential benefiting Kamala Harris.
Well, I was just going to say, well, forget individuals. This seemed to be a blow to the progressives. This is about giving a mainstream Democratic candidate a chance to win the nomination early, rather than a progressive getting momentum that suddenly could turn the party too far to the left. That's what this calendar looks like to me, if you want to put Michigan and Georgia that far high, too, because we know the African-American Democratic electorate is much more moderate than the progressive white electorate.
Absolutely. And you look at Iowa, that, you know, there are Democrats who caucus, some of the most liberal, you know, caucuses in the country. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's something that, you know, we've been hearing, too. This is, you know, a repudiation of the so-called woke left that, right, you know, that did not vote for the Biden types or the moderate types in Iowa or in New Hampshire.
Now, what about, I had somebody ask me this, what about the rest of the states? When is there going to be the following Tuesday, the Super Tuesday for everything else? Or are they going to try to space this out a bit?
So here's the dates. You have February 3rd is what they're recommending for South Carolina. February 6th, they're recommending Nevada and New Hampshire go at the same time. That's what New Hampshire is really mad about. They're trying to leapfrog, right? Georgia, February 13th, and then Michigan last on the 27th.
And then everybody else will go the next Tuesday.
Everyone goes. Right. Exactly.
Hey, Natasha, this is always a fun story to cover. Best meetings I go to are the Rules and Bylaws Committee meetings of these two committees. So enjoy it. Thank you. And thank you all for being with us this hour. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it is Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. Meet the newest member of the Democratic leadership team, House Minority Whip Congresswoman Catherine Clark, and Israel's Prime Minister-designate, Benjamin Netanyahu, are among my guests.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.